Hello and welcome to China Now with me, Makiza Latifa, a show tailored to bring you all that's happening in China and beyond. So we kickstart the show with China Currents, where Chris brings us up to speed with the most trending stories making headlines across China. Among the top stories, China's foreign minister met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, with both sides describing the talks as positive despite a subtle air of tension. Also making waves, the China Association for Science and Technology has released a list of 30 major scientific problems that they believe humanity must solve, offering a glimpse into a future that feels straight out of science fiction. And at the 2025 World Swimming Championship, doping test data show Chinese athletes were tested twice as often as their US counterparts, raising questions about fairness. In international sports, Chris has the full details of these stories and many more. So let's dive in.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on the latest developments in China. I'm Chris, and in this episode, Chinese ships in the Strait of Hormuz surged overnight. Foreign vessels are now sailing under China's national flag as a maritime talisman. Chinese Foreign Minister met with US Secretary of State Rubio, and both spoke positively about the meeting, even amid a hint of uneasiness. A new device in Xinjiang cotton plantations had solved the hardest manual task in planting. The China Association for Science and Technology released 30 major scientific problems most worth solving for humanity, outlining a sci-fi style future. And doping control frequency at the 2025 World Aquatics Championship revealed Chinese swimmers were tested twice as often as US athletes. A food safety accident at a kindergarten broke Chinese hearts, with 6 provincial-level departments involved in the investigation. Our first story covers last week's press conference by China's Ministry of National Defense. China's spokesperson was asked to comment on a recent rise in foreign vessels sailing under the Chinese national flag in the Strait of Hormuz to avoid being attacked. The Strait of Hormuz is located south of Iran and serves as a key channel for Middle East oil bound for global markets. About 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through it. In recent Iran-Israel conflict, Iran threatened to block the strait as a political lever. Earlier on, Chinese military media suggested that it was unlikely for foreign ships to raise Chinese flags, but data from the Automatic Identification System, or AIS, showed that some vessels were deliberately implying an association with China, hoping to appear less likely targets. For example, the Panama-flagged container ship Summit Singapore, bound for the Gulf of Aden, listed Chinese crew in its AIS despite having no Chinese crew on board. At the end of last month, Reuters cited maritime intelligence firm Windward, reporting that 55 vessels transmitting 101 atypical messages across the Gulf and Red Sea from June 12th to 24th, including China-owned and Russian crude, in hope of preventing attacks because those countries are less likely to be targeted than Western ships. At China's Defense Ministry briefing, spokesperson Jiang Bin commented, "Justice lies with the people." He added, China will continue to stand on the side of peace, on the side of justice, on the side of historical correctness, injecting stability and positive energy into regional and world peace and stability. Turning to diplomacy, on July 11th, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio had a sit-down talk on the sidelines of the ASEAN meeting in Kuala Lumpur. The meeting came as Beijing and Washington sought to stabilize their complex relationship, marked in recent months by escalating trade dispute. And frankly, tensions were already building before the recent tariff disagreement 6 months ago. Wang Yi had called Rubio and warned him to 好自为之, a phrase that quickly went viral online. China's foreign ministry translated it as act accordingly, while Reuters rendered it more sternly as conduct yourself well. But this recent meeting appeared extremely courteous and restrained. A Chinese readout described the talk as positive, pragmatic, and constructive. Foreign Minister Wang Yi told U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio he hoped Washington would approach China in an equal, respectful, and mutually beneficial manner and find a correct way for China and U.S. to get along, according to a statement from China's Foreign Ministry. Rubio also spoke positively. While the U.S. and China disagreed on some matters, the talk gave us some things we can work on together. He also hinted at a possible meeting between President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping this year. He said the odds are high, but added that both sides needed to build the right atmosphere and the right deliverables. Despite official portrayals of calm and harmony, observers were not so sure. Foreign media noted that the Rubio-Wang meeting lasted about an hour, whereas Wang's meeting with former U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in July last year, also at an ASEAN gathering, lasted nearly 90 minutes. They also highlighted Rubio's special status in China. He has been sanctioned twice by Beijing, becoming the first sitting Secretary of State to face such penalties. On the other hand, Chinese netizens and state media seem more willing to give Rubio the benefit of doubt, hoping that US will return to a more rational approach toward China. Today's third story comes from China's Xinjiang province, where alleged forced labor in cotton fields is supposed to have happened, according to Western media. In reality, Xinjiang's cotton fields are introducing new automated machines to replace the delicate manual labor of cotton harvesting. The new machine is designed to perform cotton topping, removing the plant's apical bud to redirect energy into side branches, resulting in larger cotton balls. Until now, this task had been done by hand, a process plagued by inefficiency, inaccuracy, and crop damage. Now, a laser topping robot is taking over. The robot was jointly developed by Xinjiang University and EA Vision Robotics Technology, a company that exports agricultural drones to countries including Japan, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, and Thailand. Using LiDAR and vision fusion, the blue laser accurately burns off the cotton bud. Field tests shows the recognition accuracy of 98.9%, damage rate of under 3%, and topping success rate above 82%. Researchers say the machine is in pilot testing. Once fully deployed, the robot can cover 0.4 to 0.5 hectares per hour, more than 10 times the efficiency of manual work. Automation reduces damage and pollution too. According to Pei Xinmin from Xinjiang Agricultural University, cotton topping is the final hurdle to fully mechanizing cotton production. As of 2024, Xinjiang already boasts an over 97% full process mechanization rate and over 90% machine harvest rate. With precision seeding, pest monitoring instruments, and drone-based spraying, mechanized cotton farming costs dropped from $1,507 per acre to $1,088 per acre, a reduction of approximately 27.8%. If the topping robot is successful, the top-tier cotton fiber may lead the world in full-process mechanization. More on China's vision for the future world. Last week, the China Association for Science and Technology released 30 major scientific challenges most worth tackling for humanity. Proposed by universities and international bodies, these 30 were chosen from 90 entries to serve as the heralds of China's scientific development. We looked into just 10 of these Chinese ambitions, and DeepSeek suggests that solving these problems alone could lead future generations to live lives drastically different from ours. Humans could desalinate seawater on a massive scale, generate energy more efficiently with longer-lasting devices, mine the moon or asteroids, employ drones, self-driving vehicles, and robots to replace humans, boost chip I/O speeds, use biomedical materials to slow aging, treat elderly diseases, or even enable organ transplants. Eventually, we could achieve secure, low-carbon, cost-effective energy systems, use satellites for remote sensing to monitor farmlands, city planning, predict earthquakes or floods, combine AI monitoring farming with biovaccines for pests, realizing precision agriculture. Turning inward, we could also use brain-machine interfaces to treat complex disorders. Some of these advances might unsettle you, just as people once feared trains and planes, but it appears we have ample time and many brilliant people to resolve these concerns, as humanity always has. Next news, a harsh reality the Chinese sports community can no longer overlook. The 2025 World Aquatics Championship opened on July 11th in Singapore, and recently the International Testing Agency, or ITA, released data on doping test frequencies for World Championship athletes. Chinese swimmers topped the list with an average of 8.8 tests per athlete, about double the rate of US athletes. The ITA has conducted 4,018 tests since January 1st, 2025, both in competition and out, about 2 tests per athlete on average. Among the 10 countries with the most swimmers, Russian athletes competing under neutral status came second, with 8.2 tests per athlete. The US and Australia averaged 4.13 and 4 tests, respectively, followed by France, Italy, Hungary, Japan, Canada, and the UK. But now you likely understand why these sparked outrage in China. During the 2024 Paris Olympics, doping was seen as weaponized against China. Chinese swimmers faced 5 to 7 urine tests per day, with only a few hours break between each. In contrast, one American athlete might only test 3 times during the whole games. Chinese audiences have also noticed a suspiciously high ratio of athletes with asthma in the US swimming team, as these conditions warrant the use of medications that are otherwise banned. At the time, one comment deeply resonated with Chinese public from scholar Shen Yi, who has over 5 million followers. We can celebrate humankind's physical limits in a pure idealistic way, but we must also recognize when events fall into strategic competition between great powers in which there are dirty moves we need to counter. Otherwise, there will be no end to our forbearance. Finally, let's review a heartbreaking story from China. Earlier this month, a tragedy struck high-end kindergarten in Tianshui, Gansu province. 233 children tested with elevated blood lead, the highest level reaching 528 micrograms per liter, 4 times China's national standard. Lead poisoning can cause permanent intellectual damage in children, and current medical treatment only slowly removes lead via chelation therapy. The suffering endured by children and their parents has touched hearts nationwide. Investigation by Chinese police found the poisoning source to be a colored cakes made by the kindergarten. They had added industrial-grade coloring, causing lead concentration over 2,000 times the national limit of 0.0 milligrams per kg. 8 individuals, including the principal and investors, have been criminally detained. But there are some rather unusual aspects to this case. The staff had no motive to poison their own institution, and teachers and chefs who ate the cakes also tested positive for lead. Even more absurdly, laboratory tests showed industrial colorants were far less efficient than food-grade ones. So to get the same hue, chefs had to use 26 times more industrial dye. The most reasonable explanation seemed to be that the kindergarten mistakenly bought industrial dye on an e-commerce platform. The unintended mistake has sparked public reflection. Many users blamed the online platform and called for mandatory bio-qualification checks when selling industrial products. At a national level, the Food Safety Commission of the State Council recently issued a document rewarding whistleblowers in food companies who report expired ingredients, illegal additives, or hygiene hazards. Latest updates: after treatment, some children's blood lead levels have fallen below 250 micrograms per liter and they are being discharged. On July 12th, the case was elevated to provincial level investigation led by top Gansu officials and 6 provincial departments. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments, please leave it below, and see you next time.
And next up is the Thinkers Forum, where leading minds and scholars share their insights on global politics and related matters. Our guest for this edition is Robert Ross, Professor of Political Science at Boston College and Associate at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at the Harvard University. According to Professor Ross, the United States is a declining power, and history shows that such moments often usher in periods of instability, competing interest, and heightened tensions. He argues that this is precisely what we're seeing play out in the US-China relationship today. So let's take a listen.
First of all, I think we all recognize we are in the midst of a major power transition. China is a rising power, the United States is declining power. Whenever that happens in history, you have severe instability, you have conflicts of interest, you have competition, and this is the US-China relationship today. And so, yes, it is a conflict of interest between a rising power that wants improved security versus a declining power that wants to maintain its status and maintain its security. This is, in many respects, a zero-sum competition. China is unhappy with American alliances built around China since the end of World War II and wants to challenge that system. The Americans, for for America, the alliance system has been the bedrock of American security since the end of World War II. We want to maintain that system. This is a manageable conflict of interest, but it's a very difficult one that creates competition in a regional scale and a global scale. Now, we should also understand that, yes, this is not a global Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union fought a global Cold War subsequent to World War II. But we do see many Cold War policies, particularly for the United States, the effort to contain the rise of China, to compete with China on tariffs, on technology controls. But it will not be a polarized world the way the Cold War was. There will be cooperation across blocks, trade across blocks. The United States will trade with Chinese allies. China will trade with American allies. We will have military exercises across relationships. This is a much safer world, a much better world than the Cold War. But yes, it is not a tit-for-tat relationship. It's a conflict of interest where each side understands the other's interests all too well and resists the other side's ability to achieve its interest. So what it will require over the longer term is coming to terms with this new reality. I think Donald Trump is intent on restoring and maintaining American hegemony and leadership in the world. He talks about making America great again, bringing American industry home, to correct the trade imbalance between China and the United States. But if we take a look at his policies more generally, he is trying to undermine China's global exports, China's global investments, China's supply chains in other countries. And the objective seems clear. He wants to slow down the Chinese economy and minimize China's economic influence around the world. This is the same policy that Joe Biden had. Now, Donald Trump is more comprehensive, going after other countries, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Europe, whether it's Korea, trying to stop them from participating in Chinese supply lines, but it seeks to maintain American hegemony. And this is a long-term struggle. Now, Donald Trump is far more comprehensive. He's also far more, shall we say, open, public, belligerent about it. Now, where he wants to end up in U.S.-China trade conflict, well, I think he would like to find a way to weaken the Chinese economy to whatever extent possible without undermining the American economy too much. He's willing to accept considerable American costs to the American worker, to the American public, but he still wants to defeat the rise of China. Now, in East Asia, this is not an economic competition, this is a security competition. And we've seen America double down on its alliances in East Asia, 4 or 5 new bases in the Philippines, growing cooperation during the Biden administration with South Korea, increased U.S.-Taiwan defense cooperation under Biden and Donald Trump. This is all part of a containment policy to resist the expansive Chinese influence in East Asia. Now, for China's part, it wants to expand its influence because it wants to undermine American encirclement of China, the challenge to Chinese security presented by the American alliance system. So again, this is a conflict of interest. It's not a tit for tat. It's not we do something, they do something, we do something, they do something. We can find a way to de-escalate. Escalation is part of the process, as each side wants to increase the other to give up its objectives or to weaken the other side's capabilities. So Donald Trump doesn't seem to have a global strategy. On the one hand, China is his target, it is his priority, yet he is doing his best to undermine cooperation with other countries to create a coalition against China. The trade war with Europe, the trade tariffs against South Korea, against Japan, against India, for example, all undermine their confidence in America's willingness to cooperate against China. And if they don't have confidence in America's resistance to the rise of China and to cooperate with them, then they're going to wonder whether they have to cooperate more with China because they cannot depend on the United States to defend them against rising China. Now, the trade relationship is simply one part of that. You cannot attack your country's trade relationships with other countries and expect them to have confidence in your defense ties. So these countries do depend on China, particularly Taiwan, particularly South Korea, as well as Japan. About half of its exports still go to China, depend on China for economic growth and development, and so they cannot afford to give up the relationship with the United States or China. So China has made clear, if you excessively cooperate with the United States, you will lose access to the Chinese market. So these countries are in a bind. How do they manage Donald Trump's threats, the tariff wars, without undermining economic cooperation with China? Thus far, they resist as best as possible. They would like to continue to cooperate with China. It's critical for their economic growth, but they also want to cooperate with American defense. Now, the future remains uncertain. We certainly have political instability, a new leadership in Taiwan, new leadership in South Korea. We have political instability in the Philippines. So we don't know what these changes in politics in South Korea and the Philippines will mean for the relationship with China. But we've already seen in South Korea an effort to strengthen relations with China, strengthen relations with North Korea, and to have a more balanced role between China and the United States. U.S. policy on economics toward South Korea certainly encouraged South Korea to move in that direction. So the United States has not had economic influence in East Asia for 10, 15 years. The U.S. inability to reduce tariffs, to reach trade agreements, the Pacific Partnership did not succeed. And so in order to exercise influence, we cannot expand our market power. We cannot open our economy. So we are dependent on our military capabilities to try and exert influence in the region. Now, China is very different. China has both economic leverage and military leverage. Its economic importance to the region is clear, whether it's South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand. China is the most important market for these countries. So it can use the threat, the challenge, the leverage of economic influence to persuade them to cooperate with China. But such economic leverage is insufficient to persuade them to reduce security cooperation with American containment policy. For that, China does depend on its military capabilities. So we've seen the Chinese Navy become more and more prominent in East Asian waters, whether it's in the East China Sea, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in the Yellow Sea. China's Navy is a constant reminder to the countries in the region that China is now a naval great power and can inflict considerable security costs on other countries, while at the same time these countries understand that America is a declining military power. So China is taking advantage of American decline and the certainty of the Trump administration to exercise its military influence to persuade them to reconsider cooperation with the United States. Now, these countries do not want to choose. Singapore has made this clear, Indonesia has made this clear, South Korea has made this clear. They do not want to choose and become simply pawns in a Cold War conflict where they have to align with one side or the other. So going forward, I expect this to continue. Indeed, I expect those countries that are more closely aligned with the U.S. today, and that would include the Philippines and South Korea, to gradually move in the direction that other countries have in trying to have a more balanced relationship with the United States and China. This is simply the result of a changing balance of power, of a power transition, and the rise of the Chinese Navy to contend with the United States, requiring other states to have a more balanced security policy. Many of us have argued that the necessity for the United States to be in the Middle East and Europe has declined. Certainly, the Russians are very weak today. They depend on North Korea for military assistance. Their GDP is very low. And of course, the European countries, the West EU countries, have a very powerful GDP, and they have funds to build their own defense. So the combination of a reduced Russian threat and greater European capabilities suggests the United States does not need to have a major presence in Europe. In the Middle East, the United States does not buy Middle Eastern oil. Israel is more secure today than ever in its history. And so the necessity for the United States to be involved in Middle East conflicts, Middle East wars, is also not easily apparent. Why are we there? But you're right. One administration after another has found it impossible to pull itself out of Middle East and Central Asian, Persian Gulf conflicts. Obama tried, Trump in his first term tried. Biden, to his credit, pulled out of Afghanistan, but then he got moved into the Ukraine and supported Israel as well. So again, this inability of America to extricate itself from the Middle East is an ongoing problem. And for many, it undermines American ability to achieve a balance of power in East Asia. America is not the country it was in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where it could wage balance of power politics on two fronts simultaneously in Europe and Asia. America now needs to prioritize. And that priority has to be East Asia, because that's where the other great power is. That's where the challenge to the American economy is. That's where the challenge is to Pacific security. And yet our ability to do so is undermined as we spread our resources thin. So yes, we do need to prioritize East Asia. We do need to reduce our footprint elsewhere in the world. But yes, the Trump administration has failed to do so. Its support for Israel, its bombing of Iran, It's all problematic, one continuation of this trend of American expanding footprint around the world when it needs to reduce that footprint and focus on Asia. So America is facing a significant challenge in contending with the rise of the Chinese military in particular. As we all know, the American industrial base has declined in recent years, so our shipbuilding capacity is very low. And whereas the Chinese shipbuilding capacity is the largest in the world, their Navy is outproducing the American Navy twice as many ships each year compared to the American Navy. So our ability to maintain that maritime balance of power is actually declining over time, despite the efforts of the Trump administration, the Biden administration, to improve the American military capabilities and its presence in East Asia. Over time, I think this trend will continue. It will take generations to rebuild the American industrial base. The former National Security Advisor called it a generational challenge. The former Chief of Naval Operations called it a decades-long challenge to rebuild America's naval base. So this is a problem that America faces and China does not. I expect that trend to continue. So this calls into question America's alliance policy in East Asia when we're seeing declining American capabilities while simultaneously doubling down on our alliances. I would expect these alliances to be less and less effective over time, and so an American defense policy would actually be better off focusing on what some would call the Quad, or others would call the Indo-Pacific strategy. So a minor retrenchment from the South China Sea, where we would maintain a presence, maintain a great power activities, but focus our defense cooperation more on India, Australia, Japan, the Western Pacific. And that would enable the United States to maintain a balance of power with less resources and to rebuild its capabilities going forward. Now, the Trump administration wants to rebuild American capabilities, but it wants to do so in one fell swoop rather than as a gradual process. And that I fear that one 4-year process will actually make America weaker, not stronger, because it will undermine American industry through tariffs, where America will no longer have access to global markets. It will undermine America's domestic industries because it will raise unemployment and inflation from tariffs. So I think we do need to reconstruct our industrial base. We do need to reform our economy. We do need to change our trade policies. But this should be a long-term policy of rebuilding rather than an overnight process that undermines American ability to contend with the rise of China. Donald Trump wants to bring American industry home. But if he brings this industry home during a trade war, then we will not have access to the global market for exports. Second, if we bring this industry home, the cost of production in the United States is so high that we will not be able to export our products to the world. American companies went offshore because the cost of manufacturing was too expensive in America. So by bringing American manufacturing home during a trade war, we will close off markets and increase the price of American products, further closing markets to American products. So this will not be a successful policy. A better policy over the longer term would actually be to invite foreign investment into the United States, to help rebuild American industry by bringing technology to America, by building our industrial base so that foreign companies would invest and pay taxes, and helping our labor conditions by hiring more workers. The United States did this in the 1970s and 80s and 90s with Japanese and German manufacturing. We brought, and later on with South Korean manufacturing, we brought car industries into America. And many Americans now feel that these are now American industries, despite their foreign ownership, because they're being manufactured in the United States. So that they are contributing to American labor, contributing to our GDP, contributing to our tax revenue. And if we were to bring China in, we would also get technology transfer for the next generation of electric vehicles. So over the longer term, trying to rebuild through foreign investment would actually improve Americans' competition with China over a longer term. Well, both sides are trying to use their leverage to achieve compromises from the other. The American wants to use its market and wants to use its influence over other countries to deny access to Chinese high technologies and access to markets and supply chains. On the Chinese side, their leverage significantly comes from their market, and so they are imposing sanctions or threatening tariffs against other countries, including Europe, or it comes from their rare earths. Now, the dependency on the world, not just America, but Europe and elsewhere, on Chinese rare earths is significant. They're part of everyday life. They go into our automobiles. They go into our cell phones. And if United States, Chinese rare earths go into our military industrial production. China understands this. Maybe over the longer term, the United States can rebuild its rare earth mining capacity, but not in the short term. And so China is basically threatening the United States that if you carry out excessive Cold War policies, excessive containment, excessive technology controls, we will weaken your military by denying it access to those rare earths necessary for your military production, so your military will decline faster than ever. The same thing with drones, by the way. Much of America is dependent on Chinese drones. That too can be controlled. So each side is trying to use whatever leverage it can to influence the other. In the short term, it does seem that Donald Trump is quite concerned about the military implications of Chinese controls over rare earths. Thus, his caution in trade negotiations with China. After putting on very high tariffs, he has been retreating persistently as in order to elicit Chinese compromises on exports of rare earths to America. But having said that, the Chinese and the Americans have made clear that technology transfers or rare earth transfers will not be allowed if they influence security. So America will not sell China high technologies that can improve the PLA, the Chinese People Liberation Army. And China has made clear that it will not sell rare earths to America that are necessary for America's containment military strategy against China. So this long-term process of technology controls and rare earth controls is now part of the U.S.-China competition and will not weaken, it will likely grow stronger. Over the long term, I would think that there would be greater decoupling in U.S.-China technology cooperation, as older technologies are no longer useful and more recent technologies are increasingly controlled by the United States. On the Chinese part, I would expect them to use their rare earths in response, so this will be a competition to see which side can better survive Cold War strategies. Well, in East Asia, it's not clear America is exercising sufficient restraint. As I mentioned, we have 5 new bases in the Philippines, one of them close to Taiwan. During the Biden administration, we increased U.S.-South Korean defense cooperation against China, and U.S.-Taiwan defense cooperation is improving. And of course, the U.S.-Japan alliance is increasingly directed at China, with increasing Japanese deployments in the East China Sea and cooperation with the Philippines and Australia. So America is actually increasing its containment policies against China. So far, the Chinese reaction, I would suggest, has been restrained. Despite the Taiwan leadership's independent diplomacy, despite the Philippines unwilling to accommodate the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea, China has refrained from using excessive coercive pressure on other countries. Should a crisis develop with Taiwan, with the Philippines, it's not at all clear that China will be reluctant to exercise its military leverage to coerce these countries to reduce cooperation with the United States. So that remains to be seen. But at this point, American restraint appears to be less than in the past, and China is waiting to see how far American provocations with the Philippines and Taiwan, how far this will go in provoking China. This remains a very dangerous situation in East Asia, over Taiwan, over the Philippines, over U.S. and Chinese presence in the South China Sea, and the future remains very uncertain and cause for concern. The Middle East is a different situation. Clearly, the Chinese have been expanding their presence, their political presence in the Middle East, whether it's cooperation with Iran, cooperation with Syria, cooperation with Saudi Arabia, and most recently, significant defense cooperation with Egypt. Now, the United States would like to reverse this trend. It's unhappy to see China's expansionism. On the other hand, the United States does not want to have a large military footprint in the Middle East. How the United States contends with this is unclear. Now, one way the Trump administration would like to do this is to remove Chinese opportunities for interference by improving Israeli relations with Arab countries. This would be very difficult given the ethnic cleansing policy of the Israelis in Gaza, given the bombing of Iran, given Israeli operations in Lebanon. It will be very difficult for other Middle Eastern countries to cooperate with Israel. The likelihood of a second round of the Abraham Accords is very unlikely. And so Chinese opportunities to expand this will continue challenging American authority in the Middle East. This is something America will have a difficult time contending with. Do we minimize our footprint? Do we focus on Asia? Or do we contend with China in the Middle East? I would think the most positive outcome would be that both sides recognize that the other is now here to stay. America cannot prevent Chinese influence in the Middle East. China buys Middle Eastern oil. The United States does not. That gives Chinese influence. China is now a major economic actor in the Middle East and increasingly a military actor. The United States and China must learn to get along in this new situation rather than simply trying to totally contain the other's presence. The Trump administration's withdrawal from global leadership is not only a concern for the global economic order, whether it's the IMF or the World Trade Organization, but we're seeing a withdrawal of American support for global issues. Climate change. China is a more important contributor to combating climate change in the United States. It is working with Europe to reach an agreement on climate change technologies. On fighting pandemics, the Trump administration has withdrawn support from the World Health Organization. China did more for combating pandemics in Africa than the United States. When it comes to combating global drug trafficking, China has actually helped on fentanyl, done a considerably better job than in the past, but the United States is growing less and less interest in cooperating with China on fentanyl, as it would rather use the fentanyl issue to put tariffs on China. So we see not only a decline of American leadership in the global economy, but in global issues and global cooperation that affects people around the world. America no longer gives economic development assistance to the developing world. China's Belt and Road Initiative far more important than the United States promoting global economic development than U.S. foreign aid. We are in many ways, under the Trump administration, ceding Chinese global leadership, ceding to China global leadership. China has become the can-do country for much of the world in the 21st century. If you want a bridge built, you go to China. You want an airport built, you go to China. You want help in managing a pandemic, you go to China. You want help in solar energy or wind energy, you go to China. This, in many respects, reflects the maturity of the American economy and the American leadership's concern for the decline of America and combating the rise of China. It reflects the hollowing out of American industry as American industry went abroad, as our welfare state, our labor unions, our prosperity increased the cost of manufacturing in the United States. But nonetheless, despite these long-term economic conditions that in many respects didn't reflect policies, America is nonetheless no longer able to lead the way it has, and it is watching China become the leader of many global issues of concern to people throughout the world. I have been going to China for many years. I've been going to China for 45 years now and many, many visits. And so I have many friends in China. And I continue to visit China frequently. And my friends are still my friends. No matter what the political changes in U.S.-China relations are, whatever the domestic changes within China, I still enjoy meeting my friends. We go out to dinner, we enjoy each other's company, and that's gratifying that our friendships and our academic relationships can continue. One of the major changes, however, is the reduced ability to have academic exchanges and people-to-people exchanges between our two countries. We particularly see this in the development of the China studies in the United States. The younger generation, on the one hand, is developing during a period of U.S.-China competition, so they are naturally less inclined to see China as a friendly country, more inclined to see China as an adversary. And then second, their opportunities for research in China is declining, as that it's increasingly difficult to carry out field research in the Chinese interior, whether in provincial capitals, whether in counties, whether in villages. And so many young American scholars are focusing on either quantitative research or archival research or historical studies. So we're witnessing the decline of American China studies in political science and economics, and I think that's detrimental to our understanding of China, to U.S.-China relations, and for the younger generation, it's detrimental to their quality of life and to their academic research, in that they simply will not have the benefits of cooperating with China. Of course, we also see this in the economic realm. My recent visits to China make clear that the American business presence in China is declining. This is also unfortunate. The opportunities for the American business community in China remain very great, and we should be able to take advantage of that. Second, that also means that the American business community can no longer try and promote U.S.-China economic cooperation when they're withdrawing from China. So I think that undermines the relationship. These are two long-term concerns which I think are detrimental to the relationship. On the Chinese side, we're finding it increasingly difficult for Chinese to visit America. In part, this reflects their experience in dealing with U.S. immigration and detentions at the border. And in part, it also reflects concern in Chinese society and in professional fields that coming to America may not be safe. During the first Trump administration, the criticism of ethnic Chinese was very strong. The anti-Chinese behavior in Americans during COVID was very strong. And I think the negative impression that Chinese have of America is deterring them from visiting America. And that includes simply Chinese public, business people, and also the scholars. So in this context of U.S.-China adversarial relations, this has been a diminished U.S.-China people-to-people, business-to-business academic relations. I always tell my Chinese colleagues that it's your job to visit America. It's your job to come here. I know it's unpleasant. I know there are concerns. But despite my concerns about the Chinese government, despite my concerns about whether or not I am of interest to the Chinese government since 1981, and whatever information the Chinese government collects on me, I continue to go to China because I think it's my job. And I think it's the Chinese scholars and business people's responsibility to come to America to maintain our dialogue. It's not easy, but I think it's important for U.S.-China relations.
And it's a wrap on this episode of China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. Thank you so much for tuning in and journeying with us through the latest stories, the bold ideas and global shifts shaping China and the world around us. My name is Makiza Micheline Latifa. Catch you next time for more conversations, more insights, and more stories that matter. Remember to send in your comments, your thoughts, feedback, and suggestions through the email provided below. Until then, keep watching Pan-African television and let China never feel far away from you anymore.